The history of American missions is often told through the lens of those who crossed oceans, yet the engine that sustained those global endeavors was frequently built and fueled on domestic soil by visionary strategists who never left the coast. Among these figures, Annie Walker Armstrong stands as a titan of institutional innovation and personal sacrifice. As the driving force behind the Woman's Missionary Union, Armstrong did not merely organize, she revolutionized the methodology of Baptist benevolence, transforming a fragmented, hand-to-mouth system of sporadic giving into a sophisticated, sustainable infrastructure of global support. Armstrong's life was a masterclass in the navigation of institutional friction, operating within a strictly patriarchal denominational framework that eventually codified the exclusion of women from official leadership messengerships. She nevertheless carved out a sphere of influence. She created a sphere that became the Southern Baptist Convention's most potent financial and mobilization asset. Her life is one of paradox, a woman who refused to address mixed audiences due to theological convictions, yet whose administrative voice echoed across continents. To understand the expansion of 19th and 20th century missions is to understand the meticulous, unpaid, and relentless labor of the dreamer in action from Baltimore. Annie Armstrong spent her youth fearing that religion would take the edge off of life, only to find that it gave her life an edge sharp enough to cut through the rigid bureaucracy of the 19th century church. From a socialite who resisted the pews to a strategist who redefined global benevolence, her journey was not one of quiet submission, but of relentless, methodical rebellion against the status quo. She proved that overcoming one's time did not always require breaking the rules. Sometimes it required rewriting the manual of operations so thoroughly that the world had no choice but to follow. The genesis of Annie Armstrong's mission-mindedness was not a product of childhood indoctrination, but rather a deliberate, mature pivot that occurred only after a period of significant internal resistance. Born into the affluence of a successful Baltimore tobacco family, Annie's early years were defined by the comforts of wealth and a vibrant social life. She guarded her lifestyle with a certain level of apprehension toward religious commitment. While many of her contemporaries were ushered into church membership during their formative years, Annie was a self-described late bloomer. Her hesitancy was rooted in a specific existential fear that the rigors of a devout life would take the edge off of life. This suggests a young woman of high spirit and intellectual vitality who perceived religion not as an enhancement, but as a potential dampener of her natural zest and social autonomy. Her eventual conversion at age 20 was therefore not a passive inheritance of tradition, but a conscious surrender of her previous identity in favor of a deeper, more substantive purpose. The primary driver behind this spiritual shift was the silent but potent witness of her mother, Mary Walker Armstrong. Following the death of Annie's father, James Dunn Armstrong, when Annie was only 2, Mary became the central pillar of the household. In a period of profound personal hardship, Mary displayed what Annie described as an indescribable peace. This tranquility was not a result of detachment, but was directly linked to Mary's active involvement in the woman's mission to woman. By observing her mother, Annie discerned a correlation between outward service and inward stability. The peace she sought was found in the very place she had initially avoided, the church. Upon her baptism into the Seventh Baptist Church of Baltimore, she did not merely join a congregation, she entered a community of practice that would define the rest of her life. The transformation from a convert to a devoted activist was accelerated by the mentorship of her pastor, Richard B. Fuller, and the specific liturgical culture of her mother's prayer circle. These weekly gatherings functioned as a primitive information network. The women shared reports from pioneer missionaries, such as those laboring in China, which bridged the gap between the local pews in Baltimore and the global mission field. This exposure served as the bridge between personal faith and corporate responsibility. Armstrong did not view missions as an abstract theological concept, but as a series of practical, urgent needs, ranging from the spiritual to the material. The prayer group's evolution into the woman's mission to woman provided Annie with her first laboratory for organizational development. It was here that her passion exploded. She realized that her inherent administrative talents could be the mechanism through which the indescribable peace she had found could be shared with the world. The driving force behind her early activism was a desire to replicate her mother's spiritual resilience. The strategy was the meticulous study of missionary reports and the discipline of communal prayer. This foundation ensured that when she eventually stepped into national leadership, her efforts were rooted in a deep-seated conviction that missions was the heartbeat of the Christian experience, rather than a mere denominational chore. Before she ever assumed the mantle of national leadership, Annie Armstrong engaged in a deliberate period of apprenticeship, building a robust portfolio of expertise across diverse mission fields. Her rise was not a product of sudden inspiration, but of a disciplined, multi-decade expansion of her administrative and social horizons. In 1880, Armstrong pivoted her focus toward the rugged realities of the American frontier. By providing relief supplies and direct aid to schools for Native American children in Oklahoma, she bypassed the romanticized notions of missions often held by her urban peers. This period served as a laboratory where she examined the mechanics of ministry, the logistical grit and structural alignment, recognizing they were just as vital as spiritual instruction. This early work earned her a reputation as a formidable advocate for home missions, a domain she believed was frequently overshadowed by international efforts. Armstrong's leadership was characterized by a rare combination of high-level strategy and grassroots consistency. In 1882, she was elected the inaugural president of the Maryland Woman's Baptist Home Mission Society, a position she navigated for 24 years. Simultaneously, she dedicated 30 years to teaching the infant class at Utah Place Baptist Church. This dual focus ensured her leadership remained grounded in the local church's life, even as she managed regional organizational complexities. A significant turning point occurred in 1886 when Armstrong recognized that the lack of centralized information was the greatest barrier to mission mobilization. Acting as both secretary and editor-in-chief of the Maryland Baptist Mission Rooms, she transformed a local office into a national publishing powerhouse. She realized that to inspire giving, one must first provide knowing. By disseminating literature that detailed the specific, raw needs of the field, she created a sense of proximity between the donor and the missionary. The final layer of her development involved confronting the burgeoning crises within her own city. Baltimore's rapid industrialization brought a flood of immigrants and concentrated poverty. This prompted Armstrong to pioneer urban missions. She personally attended to the sick and the marginalized at Baltimore's ports. She demonstrated that her vision for missions was not just global or rural, but deeply local and social. This multifaceted background ensured that when she eventually proposed a national union, she did so with the authority of someone who had labored in every corner of the mission field. The birth of the Woman's Missionary Union was not a harmonious evolution. It was a strategic response to systemic exclusion. Armstrong and her colleagues operated within a climate that was increasingly suspicious of women's institutional power. The strategic mandate for a formal organization was catalyzed by a specific moment of disenfranchisement during the 1885 Southern Baptist Convention. When women messengers from Arkansas were disqualified, the convention took the drastic step of amending its constitution to replace the inclusive term messengers with brethren. This legalistic maneuver effectively locked women out of the official decision-making rooms for the next 33 years. Rather than retreating, Armstrong saw this as the signal to create a parallel structure where women's efforts could be concentrated and controlled by women themselves. In 1887, Armstrong joined forces with Martha E. McIntosh to design a more sophisticated mechanism for benevolence. They sought to dismantle the hand-to-mouth system, a sporadic, reactionary way of giving, and replace it with a systematic, dependable flow of resources. To achieve formal recognition, they launched a massive letter-writing initiative to ensure every state elected delegates for a national body. This was a masterstroke of political organization. The opposition Armstrong faced was rooted in a profound fear of slippery slopes. Male leaders argued that if women were granted an organized mission board, they would inevitably seek the deaconship, then the pulpit, and then the entire church. To neutralize this threat, Armstrong utilized her theological convictions to her advantage. By maintaining that women's work would remain strictly focused on women and children and subordinate to existing male mission boards, she gained the necessary space to build her empire. On May 14, 1888, in Richmond, Virginia, the Executive Committee of the WMU was officially formed by women representing 12 states. Armstrong did not just attend, she chaired the meeting and was elected as the first corresponding secretary, effectively the executive director. This founding was bolstered by the support of the legendary Lottie Moon, who was a missionary in China, who recognized that a combination of efforts would elicit far greater financial support than individual pleas ever could. Under Armstrong's leadership, the WMU began its journey as the financial backbone of the entire denomination. While the founding of the WMU provided the legal framework, Annie Armstrong's true genius lay in her ability to construct an operational engine that could sustain a global movement. She understood that a mission board without a communication strategy was merely a theoretical entity. To bridge the gap between the affluent pews of Baltimore and the dust of the frontier, she became a pioneer of mass communication and organizational psychology. Armstrong's commitment to operational integrity was perhaps most visibly demonstrated by her refusal to accept a salary. During her 18-year tenure as corresponding secretary, she declined any financial compensation, ensuring that every cent raised could be funneled directly to the field. This was not merely an act of piety. It was a calculated administrative move that granted her unparalleled moral authority. When she asked others to give, she spoke as someone who had already given everything. Her workload was Herculean. In a single year, she was known to write over 18,000 letters by hand. This relentless correspondence served as the connective tissue of the organization. Through these letters, she did not just issue directives, she mentored state leaders, counseled discouraged missionaries, and lobbied pastors. She transformed the office from a stationary room into a dynamic hub of global intelligence. Recognizing that ignorance was the greatest enemy of benevolence, Armstrong expanded her earlier work with the Maryland mission rooms into a national distribution network. She curated and edited hundreds of leaflets, tracts, and programs. She understood that to motivate a donor in Georgia to support a missionary in China, the donor needed to see the mission through vivid, factual reporting. She championed a democratization of giving. Rather than relying solely on wealthy benefactors, she implemented a system of consistent, small-scale contributions. This empowered every woman, regardless of her economic status, to feel like a vital stakeholder. Armstrong's most enduring structural innovation was the creation of dedicated seasons of prayer, coupled with special offerings. In 1888, responding to Lottie Moon's desperate plea for reinforcements in China, Armstrong organized the first Christmas offering for foreign missions. The reason behind these seasons was to synchronize the spiritual and the financial. By aligning specific prayer requests with a call to action, she ensured that giving was an act of worship rather than a tax. These seasons created a predictable annual influx of capital that allowed mission boards to plan for long-term expansion rather than surviving on erratic donations. Annie Armstrong's vision was never monolithic. She possessed a unique ability to see the hidden mission fields that others overlooked. Her strategy for expansion was rooted in the belief that the gospel must be as mobile and diverse as the population it sought to reach. At a time when many institutional structures remained rigid, Armstrong pushed for the inclusion of marginalized groups within the missionary framework. Building on her earlier work in Oklahoma, she advocated for sustained funding for schools and churches among indigenous populations, arguing that the home field was as spiritually needy as any foreign shore. In a move that was progressive for her era and social context, she actively supported the work of the National Baptist Convention. She recognized that racial barriers should not impede the distribution of resources and training, fostering a level of cooperation that was rare in the post-Reconstruction South. Following the Spanish-American War, Armstrong saw a strategic opening in Cuba. She was instrumental in mobilizing the WMU to provide the first permanent church building in Havana, treating the island not just as a political territory, but as a spiritual responsibility. Simultaneously, she turned her gaze toward the portals of America. She viewed the massive waves of immigrants entering through cities like Baltimore and New Orleans not as a social threat, but as a divine appointment. She established industrial schools and mission stations at the docks, providing practical aid, literacy, and vocational training as a bridge to spiritual engagement. The reason behind this broad expansion was her conviction that missions were an all-inclusive mandate. She famously stated that she was the property of the WMU, meaning her entire identity was subsumed by the work. For Armstrong, a mission that only focused on one demographic was a mission that had lost its biblical compass. Her ability to manage these diverse interests simultaneously, from a high society prayer meeting in Richmond to a poverty-stricken school in the West, solidified her status as the preeminent strategist of the Southern Baptist Convention. While Annie Armstrong is most frequently associated with the collection of funds, her contribution to the pedagogical foundations of the Southern Baptist Convention was equally transformative. She realized that the sustainability of the missionary enterprise was tethered to the biblical literacy of the next generation. For Armstrong, education was the primary vehicle through which a missionary heart was cultivated. Armstrong's approach to education was far from academic. It was deeply practical. Her 30-year tenure teaching the infant class at Utah Place Baptist Church was not a peripheral hobby, but a core component of her strategy. She utilized the classroom as a site for early childhood mobilization. She translated complex global needs into narratives accessible to children, fostering a sense of world-mindedness long before it was a common educational goal. By doing so, she ensured that the mission movement would not die with her generation, but would be replenished by youth who viewed global service as a natural extension of their faith. The reason behind her fierce advocacy for a centralized Sunday school board was rooted in a desire for doctrinal and missional uniformity. In 1891, she played a pivotal role in its establishment. She understood that if every church used disparate materials, the denomination would remain fragmented. Furthermore, she was instrumental in the creation of the Maryland Baptist Mission Rooms. This entity was not merely a storage facility for tracts, it was a sophisticated publishing house. Under her guidance, it produced a constant stream of mission studies, curricula designed to be taught in local churches. This systematic approach to education meant that Baptist women and children were not just giving to missions, they were becoming experts in the geography, culture, and specific challenges of the mission fields they supported. The final chapter of Annie Armstrong's active leadership was marked by a profound tension between her institutional loyalty and her personal convictions regarding missionary training and ecclesiastical authority. The primary point of friction arose over the proposal for a permanent women's missionary union training school in Louisville, Kentucky. To many, this seemed a natural progression. However, Armstrong was vehemently opposed. Her opposition was multifaceted. First, she feared the high financial cost would divert funds from the front lines of the mission field. Armstrong valued the volunteer spirit above all else. She worried that a formal training school might create a class of professional missionaries who were more concerned with credentials than with sacrificial grassroots labor. This disagreement was exacerbated by a growing rift with the national WMU president, Fannie Heck. The two women represented different philosophies of leadership. Armstrong's was a hands-on, traditional model, while Heck's was aligned with the emerging professionalization of women's work. The reason for the eventual break was ultimately a matter of principle. When the WMU moved forward with shifts that Armstrong felt compromised her original vision, she chose the path of total departure rather than compromise. In 1906, after 18 years of unpaid, exhaustive service, she resigned her position. The intensity of her conviction was such that following her resignation, she vowed to have nothing to do with SBC mission work. This was not an act of petty resentment, but a manifestation of her characteristic all-or-nothing temperament. For 32 years, she lived a relatively quiet life in Baltimore, remaining largely disconnected from the national convention she had essentially built. This period of silence serves as a poignant reminder of the personal cost of high-stakes institutional leadership and the deep-seated convictions that governed her every move. She proved that even in silence, a life built on a manual of operations, rewritten by faith, becomes a heartbeat that a denomination can never stop hearing. The measure of Annie Armstrong's life is found in the sheer scale of the infrastructure she left behind. While she passed away in 1938 at the age of 83, the mechanisms she engineered continued to accelerate. Historians frequently referred to her as a dreamer in action or an efficient manager. These titles capture her duality. She possessed the visionary capacity to imagine a global network and the administrative discipline to make it a reality. She is credited with advancing Southern Baptist missions more than perhaps any other single individual in the history of the convention. The organization she founded has evolved into the largest Protestant women's organization in the world. Its impact is most clearly seen in its financial legacy. In its first 110 years, the WMU raised nearly $2.5 billion for missions. The naming of the Annie Armstrong Easter offering in 1934 served as a late career validation of her efforts. It ensured her name would forever be synonymous with the home missions she so dearly loved. Annie Armstrong's life is a testament to the power of a single, focused life. By refusing a salary and mastering the art of communication, she constructed a legacy that transcended her own lifetime. She demonstrated that one does not need to cross an ocean to change the world. Sometimes, the most effective how begins with a pen, a prayer, and a desk in Baltimore. Annie Armstrong's greatest fear was that a life of devotion would take the edge off of life. Instead, she found that her faith sharpened that edge into a tool that carved out a legacy for millions. As you look at the challenges of our own time, ask yourself, are you protecting your edge for your own comfort, or are you willing to let it be sharpened for a purpose that outlasts you? Like Annie, you might find that your greatest contribution begins the moment you stop resisting the call to act. If you want to go deeper into the lives of those who refuse to let their edge be blunted, join our community. Subscribe to Theology today, and let's rediscover the radical roots of our heritage together.